Sustainability in Metropolitan Planning, Urban Ecology, a Different Perspective on Urban Dispersion. Federal University of Bahia, UFBA, Salvador, Brazil. Our presentation is about Salvador, capital city of Bahia, one of the biggest states of Brazil, with almost the same size as France. Salvador is one of the oldest cities in Brazil and Latin America. Founded in 1549, it was the first capital city of Brazil until 1763, and today it is the center of a metropolitan region with 4.3 million inhabitants, the third city population in Brazil. Urbanization and metropolization of Salvador. Salvador, on the shores of a bay, Baía de Todos os Santos, had political, administrative, and commercial functions. However, despite this condition and the dynamism associated with it, its occupation did not advance more rapidly until the mid-19th century. Primary mode exporter. In addition, the regional economy took the basic characteristics of a colonial economy and was structured with an agro-mercantile character, facing the international market and founded initially in the sugarcane industry, which was integrated in trade flows of European capitalism and arrived to the capital city through the bay, by sea. First industrial phase and national integration. National integration begins with the connection by road from the southeast to the northeast of Brazil. Road infrastructure reverses the direction of the flows of capital and production to Salvador. It follows the new road axis. Due to political decisions in the 1950s, after the discovery of oil in neighboring towns, today part of its metropolitan area, Salvador surpassed the long stagnation of economic backwardness and launched the basis to the economic growth, betting on the industrial development based on oil extraction and its refining processes. Second industrial phase, tourism and tertiary city. Throughout the 1950s, there was a change in the pattern of insertion in the inter-regional division of labor, and the city started to follow and experience development. Production and advancement of the country's urbanization, albeit with a local increase in social problems that characterize these processes nationally. During the 70s, the second development leap, when investments focused on the chemical and petrochemical industry, both main complexes were established with a distance of approximately 20 kilometers from the old city center. This initiative has benefited a net of cities around Salvador. Third industrial phase, tourism and tertiary city. Salvador has consolidated the status of a commercial and service hub. In 1970, the process of metropolization begins, when the urban problems reached a high degree of complexity as increased commuting to reach the industrial centers, huge discrepancy of all types of urban infrastructure that did not allow workers to live near their jobs. At the same time, the free land inside Salvador was fully occupied by the end of the century. Production after the 2008 crisis. The 2008 international crisis reoriented the flow of foreign investments in the metropolitan region. Living space continued growing and enhancing the city's density. That already was around 8,500 inhabitants per square kilometer. Salvador has kept a light level of growth, while other cities in the region, mainly those where industrial complexes are established and those along the shores, started to become better prepared for its expansion. More and diverse industries, tourism expansion internationally integrated, and continual pace of infrastructure improvement, exploding urban fabric in the regional territory along the transportation axis. The population growth reflects the expansion and modernization of the old capital since when it was triggered between 1960 and 1980, with the implementation of major urban projects that accompanied and anticipated the vectors of urban expansion and intensive informal occupation of low-income families in the periphery. Since the interventions that removed low-income family houses to clear space for the opening of so-called valley avenues in 1960, and then with the implementation of real estate investments and road infrastructure, resulting in the formation of an extremely unequal and segmented urban space. From the traditional center, three quite different expansion vectors inside Salvador took shape: Atlantic Coast, the Miolo, and the railway suburbs on the coast of the Bay de Todos os Santos. These three vectors configure three diverse cities. The traditional city. Around the old center and its surroundings, urban fabric is compact, relatively homogeneous. There is not a single population growth, and it is occupied predominantly by the middle class. Modern and compact city. The Atlantic Coast is the affluent area of the city, a privileged place of residence, services, and leisure, which concentrates wealth, public investment, urban facilities, places of tourist attractions, the interest of real estate capital, and opportunities of employment and higher income. In the modern city located at the coast, the urban fabric is changing. We have new housing and consumption centers and services. High architectural and urban standards, verticalization in the most dense areas, near the center, close to the Atlantic coast, and growing towards the north coast. It is inhabited primarily by higher levels of the social hierarchy. The Miolo, located in the geographic center of the city, began to be occupied with the implementation of housing projects for the so-called lower middle class. Its expansion was continued by popular allotments and successive invasions, with a low availability of equipment and services. The suburban railway had its occupation initially driven by the installation of a railway line in 1860, and from the 1940s became the site of many popular allotments that have been expanded in the following decades, with its open spaces also invaded. Precarious city. These vectors shaped the precarious city. It is inhabited predominantly by the popular sectors. In the areas near the center and in consolidated neighborhoods, we have verticalization processes, a huge density, a little better housing pattern. This became one of the poorest and problem areas of the city, marked by precarious housing in terms of infrastructure, by deficiency in urban equipment and services, and more recently by high levels of violence. In more peripheral areas, the urban fabric is characterized by dispersion and continued expansion. Substandard housing, largely auto-constructed, with horizontal occupation. The demographic trends point to a stability of the population growth in the municipality of Salvador, the core of the metropolitan region, and a sprawl at the other centers in the peri-urban space. Metropolis sprawl. Rapidly and progressively, Salvador has been transformed into a city region. Around the 90s, it began to spread its territory. The closest municipalities, cities, became organized as autonomous and complete centers, although still maintaining a great discrepancy in terms of urban services. With the inauguration of the new Ford automotive plant and expansion of the industrial complex, the economic activity was enhanced and the relations within the metropolitan space expanded and increased, reaching distances over 100 kilometers. The international crisis in 2008 influenced the metropolitan economy. Otherwise, the expansion would have advanced significantly. The urban areas added each decade clearly conform vectors of growth. Analyzing inside that pulverized disposal of urban areas, we see that they are partially occupied with urban fabric. Around 40% for the areas added to urban category between 1990 and 2000, and around 15% for those that were incorporated to urban space in the last decade, 2000 to 2010, be it areas at the boundaries of the urbanization or along road connectors or isolated ones. Undoubtedly and unfortunately, more and more urban fabric will be built and new expansions will bring even more pressure to the environment, mainly in the formed vectors directions: center north, intermetropolitan, north shore, and south. Focusing on the dispersion process and comparing the development axis with the population concentration, each point in the map corresponds to 500 inhabitants projection to 2030. We can see pattern of linear concentration along the shore side, but along the vectors of urban growth in the interior, we have, besides the vector's direction of growth, a condition of dispersive occupation. The center-north vector is mainly in the direction of the petrochemical and automotive assembly plants. The perspective of new jobs have attracted many people to these industries, but only a few have been employed. Recently, low-income communities without access to regular education, which represents 70% of the population, have demanded government incentives for agricultural projects within the city limits. This example of dispersive occupation shows a development along a road that crosses a patch of disturbed Atlantic forest mixed with exotic invasive species, and the presence of industries that always offer the risk of soil pollution with spills of chemicals and fuels, as well as atmospheric emissions of CO2. Here, a border occupation of the urban fabric. The surroundings have low urbanization and construction aggregate mining on open pits with no ecological restoration. Open areas have been deforested and occupied with degraded pasture, showing signs of soil erosion. The intermetropolitan vector, especially, connects two metropolitan regions, the city of Salvador and the second city of the state of Bahia, Feira de Santana, situated at a distance of 120 kilometers, which clearly puts under pressure the natural areas in between them. This shows an occupation in the border of Bahia de Todos os Santos, a bay that lies inside an environmental protected area. The legal protection has not been enough to stop multiple impacts. Here, poverty and unplanned settlements, frequently turned into slums, have caused great pressure on the environment. Mangrove forests have been harvested for building materials and firewood. Contaminated by sewage outflows, landfilled to expand construction sites, and transformed into aquaculture ponds. A promising, sustainable tourism industry is being lost to degradation. One isolated urban fabric in the midst of a still forested rural environment. This area, originally covered by the Atlantic forest, one of the most biodiverse tropical rainforests in the world, has been degraded. Agriculture, mainly sugarcane, and extensive cattle pastures have caused severe landscape fragmentation. The North Shore vector shows two patterns of occupation, in the inner side and in the shore side. Three inner areas represent this occupation in three different municipalities, all of them pressuring over river basins. The first picture shows a set of isolated areas connected by a road where we can see forest fragments very close to an important water reservoir. The other picture shows an urban expansion reaching the river margin, but we cannot say for how long. This third area, in the inner side of the North Shore vector, was designed for a socioeconomic middle-class occupation, also in the margin of a river, with many environmental threats. There has been an occupation and landfill of the mangroves, wetlands, lakes, and sand dunes. An access road was built over the estuary canal, partially blocking the tide flow, essential for the mangrove survival. The set of areas in the shore side on North Shore vector represents the urban fabric of the highest socioeconomic class. Two of them can be considered isolated areas, and the third, a very dense urbanization that reflects the most intensive rhythm of growth in the metropolitan region. These two are residential areas. The upper image, less dense, shows a closed condo. The other one, a pattern of urbanization on single units and little condos, one of the most dense areas of the metropolis. Here we can see a touristic occupation around the small village of Embaçaí, pressuring the river and trespassing it to occupy as close as possible to the beach. In the upper one, an international complex and some small hotels in details. The south vector is a hypothetical scenario that will only come true if an already planned bridge is built in the future, connecting the city of Salvador to the island of Itaparica. In terms of environmental threats, regardless of the bridge, enough damage is already going on due to the lack of urban planning. In the end, by means of our ride through the metropolis frontier, we have seen non-planned developing areas and also planned areas that both relate to the environment in a way that brings up a reflection on urban ecology. Considering the importance of maintaining healthy environmental conditions and to find solutions for social concerns in a metropolitan area, a reality found in most urban metropolises in the underdeveloped world. In the largest and schematic site of the environmental structure, privileging the water basin's disposition and analyzing the vectors of the city expansion and the dispersed occupation, yet identified, we perceive they are crossing lines, almost perpendicular to one another. Without intervention, the vector lines tend to continue to be reinforced because of intensification of transportation, commerce, and other facilities that are very close to important roadways. As we can see in the hypsometric map, the vectors intercept the slopes of the river's direction to the sea, which flows to the Atlantic shore, and constitute barriers to the natural direction of superficial water drainage. The expansion metropolis vectors crosses adapted use planning with a clear objective to effectively establish a projectable intention directing the use and occupation of land, facing a laissez-faire organization of urban settlements, could lead to great achievements such as implementation of agriculture in metropolitan areas, giving function to the vacuum spaces resultant of the dispersion processes of urban occupation, reuse of water, wastewater, reuse of and recycling materials, and many other sustainable procedures in the closed cycle, enhancing the use of materials with a tremendous result in terms of environmental gain. To close our comments and concerns about the metropolis expansion, we take the word of Lowe to say we believe the perspective of elevating spatial and environmental conditioning factors to compose strongly with the economic and social factors are the main decision arguments envisioning more sustainable post-metropolitan development. And as Grimm, 2007, we are here strongly connected with these ideas on how to introduce and make the urban ecology a main direction in urban and regional planning, especially related with the density strategies for urban growth in terms of a balanced environment and in terms of regulating new urban conceptions for a world that soon will become completely concentrated in city regions, but has been leaving behind the urban concentration around 78% of land completely transformed in its unsustainable way of growing. Salvador demands urban ecology proposals to guarantee a sustainable development in order to mitigate social inequality, land occupation, dependency on fossil fuels, engaging in a positive urban growth trajectory. Thank you for your attention.